pleasure then to introduce our guest speaker for this evening, Dr. Peter Habersberger, AM, RFD, RAN retired, who many of you know is a prominent member of our Victorian chapter. So I'll touch briefly on his naval career, though be mindful that he's been a leading heart surgeon in civilian. Oh, I thought you cut people as well. Oh. I'm sure there's a couple of people here who've been cut. Anyway, at least a cardiologist in Melbourne in civilian practice for many years. But he graduated in medicine from the University of Melbourne in 1965, joined the RAN Reserve in HMAS Lonsdale down in Port Melbourne as a surgeon lieutenant, clearly seeking glamour and a flashy uniform. Thereafter, he undertook annual continuous training in various ships and establishments. In 1985, he was appointed as the Principal Medical Officer at Lonsdale, and in 1989, the Principal Health Consultant of the Director General of Naval Health Services. Later, he was appointed the organising Naval Medical Officer. He was appointed as the Director of Naval Health Services and was responsible for organising naval medical officers to serve in Gulf War I and Gulf War II. In 1997, he was appointed to Assistant Surgeon General, Navy, with the rank of Commodore, a position he held for 6 years. He transferred to the retired list in 2006, but you'd never guess it looking at it. Subsequently, he became a member of the Defence Reserves Association State Committee and has chaired that committee since November 2023. I don't want to steal his thunder, but I just want to say that I think his talk is about the tragic loss of the Australian hospital ship Centaur after she was torpedoed off Brisbane on passage to New Guinea in the early hours of 14 May 1943. The loss of 268 lives, including many Army medical and nursing staff. No doubt he will cover the public outrage, which was considered a war crime, basically. Protests were made by the Australian and British government in Japan, but it was not until the 1970s that they learned the identity of the attacking submarine. And that's when it became public. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Peter Habersberger. Thank you.
Good evening, all. It's interesting, this is a Naval Historical Association, but there are no Navy officers involved or Navy personnel. It was largely Army. But in the early hours of the 14th of May, 1943, the survivors of the Australian hospital ship Centaur were struggling for their lives in the dark, oily waters of the Pacific Ocean, only a few miles east of Brisbane, just off Moreton Island. The sinking of this non-combatant vessel during wartime, with its high death toll, had a deep emotional impact on the Australian people as well as our allies. And as you just heard, of the 332 personnel who sailed on the ship when it left Sydney, en route to Port Moresby, only 64 were picked up and survived. Today, very few Australians know of the Centaur, and to my knowledge, there is not one survivor still with us. The Centaur was a ship of 3,220 tonnes, built in 1923 as a small trading vessel. She was built as a highly manoeuvrable ship with a shallow draft to enable her to get in and out of small tropical ports, and her reinforced flat-bottomed hull permitted her to sit on the mud during low tide in Broome. Two large open decks were built to transport cattle, while cargo space made provision for carriage of such goods as timber, wool and building materials, and it was destined to run from Fremantle to Singapore, serving ports on the west coast of Australia as well as on Java and then on to Singapore. In November 1941, the Centaur was involved in rescuing a small number of survivors from the Cormorant, which had sunk HMAS Sydney 1 week earlier. The survivors were towed to Carnarvon and then transported to Fremantle on the Centaur, now under the watchful eye of 40 Army Guards. With the fall of Singapore and the bombing of Darwin and Broome, there was no longer any use for the Centaur on the West Australian coast, and so she was taken over by the Shipping Control Board and brought to Melbourne, where she was subsequently used to carry sugar between Lucinda in Queensland and Brisbane and Sydney. On the 4th of January 1943, the Centaur was acquired by Defence authorities for £125,000. The transfer was somewhat complicated by the fact that the ship was British owned. The next stage was to convert her into a modern hospital afloat. As of today, this turned out to be a difficult, time-consuming and expensive affair, with the establishment of wards to accommodate 250 patients, a lift between the decks, ample refrigeration and freshwater storage was increased to 750 tonnes. The promenade deck and the first-class smoking room, veranda cafe and the bar were transformed into a modern, fully equipped operating theatre and pharmacy. There was also a dental surgery, pathology laboratory, linen store and food storage areas. The nurses were lodged on the starboard side of the promenade deck and the doctors were on the port side, with the ship's company below. The renovations were made more difficult by demands from the maritime unions, who insisted on single berth cabins for the boatswain, carpenter, storekeepers and engine room crew, as well as insisting on hot and cold running water to showers and washrooms. That the Navy was stunned by these demands is evident from a minute paper later written by the Director of Naval Engineering. But Navy had no choice but to totally rework the plans for crew accommodation. Not unexpectedly, all of this took longer than anticipated and was much more expensive. The original estimate of £20,000 reaching £54,000, an increase of 175% on the original estimate. What's new? While the workers hammered away at Williamstown, the Australian Commonwealth Naval Board pushed ahead with the Centaur's registration as a hospital ship. Now, the requirements of the Hague Convention of the time were added with 4 green bands, and this shows up the picture of the ship, 4 green bands on both sides from bow to stern, 3 large red crosses on the hull on both sides, 2 large red crosses on either side of the funnel lit by internal electric light, horizontal red crosses on the navigation bridge and the wheelhouse, whilst on the bow on either side was stencilled in black and white the registered number, to ensure that the Axis powers were formally notified of the existence of the Australian hospital ship Centaur. Until this procedure was completed, the ship could not put to sea. However, on the 5th of February 1943, the Swiss government informed the Japanese government of the details regarding the Centaur. On the 4th of March, the Italian government requested further details regarding the Centaur, but there is no record that the Japanese ever acknowledged receipt of this advice. However, the ship was formally commissioned on the 1st of March 1943. She had a crew of 75 from the Merchant Navy, along with 19 Army medical officers, 12 Army nursing officers, 226 other ranks, and a civilian Red Cross representative. 194 of the personnel on board were from the 2nd 12th Field Ambulance. The officer commanding the hospital ship was Lieutenant Colonel Manson, who had served with the 10th Field Ambulance since 1937. He was a large, jolly-faced, well-rounded man, ex-Scotch college boy, and Melbourne University graduate in medicine, who soon endeared himself to all on board. He had the kind of dynamic personality which enabled him to join in any shore-going activities with subordinates without losing their respect. The 2nd 12th Field Ambulance was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Outridge. The matron was Sarah Jewell, who was of short stature, very reserved and prim and proper in her outlook. She exercised rigid discipline over her nursing sisters and other staff, obviously feeling it was up to her to counterbalance the more relaxed approach of the commanding officer. On the 12th of March, the ship sailed from Melbourne to Sydney. The voyage showed that the hospital equipment needed to be secured against the roll of the ship. Some of the portholes leaked, flooding portions of the ship, and there were other engineering matters which had to be corrected. The ship then sailed from Sydney to Brisbane, and during that voyage it was found there were only 35 sets of crockery, where it was anticipated that up to 100 patients would have to be fed at any one time. The next voyage was from Brisbane to Townsville, carrying patients for the first time on her return voyage. From the 8th to the 18th of April, the ship travelled to Port Moresby and returned, embarking 200 patients, including 100 stretcher cases, for the trip south. In his report, Lieutenant Colonel Manson was very critical of the lack of lifeboat accommodation, and you will notice that there's only 2 lifeboats on the port side and 2 on the starboard side. When the ship was full of patients, there were 120 military personnel and 50 patients who would have no lifeboat accommodation, although there were rafts available to which they could cling to by hand. Interestingly, the Merchant Navy crew were entitled to a seat in the boats before patients by virtue of their agreement when signing on. Centaur returned to Sydney, and whilst being loaded for the return voyage, a controversy erupted over the right of the ambulance officers of the 2nd 12th Field Ambulance to carry rifles to protect their vehicles. Wharf labourers refused to continue with the loading, arguing that this was against the rules of the Hague Convention. Lieutenant Colonel Manson undertook inquiries as to the legal position regarding this matter, and on being informed that it was in order, 52 rifles and 2,000 rounds of ammunition were taken onto the Centaur. Again, this caused further rumours amongst the wharf labourers that the ship was loading ammunition, and representatives of the Seamen's Union made a thorough search of all the cargo on the ship and on the wharf, but found nothing suspicious. On Wednesday, the 12th of May, the Centaur slipped quietly out of Sydney Harbour for a further voyage to Port Moresby to pick up casualties and to deliver the 2nd 12th Field Ambulance for its tour of duty in New Guinea. As the Centaur steamed up the coast, Captain Murray, the captain of the ship, made a minor change to the route approved by Naval Control Service, believing the original route took them too far out to sea, and so he travelled a parallel course some 80 miles closer to the coast, some 30 miles from the mainland. At 4:10 on the Friday the 14th of May 1943, there was an enormous explosion on the port side, just prior to the bridge, with the oil fuel tank being hit. Burning oil was thrown over the forepart of the ship and the superstructure quickly collapsed, the funnel crashing into the buckled deck and with everything being covered with burning oil. The ship broke in 2 and sank in 3 minutes. The majority of the Australian Army Medical Corps personnel were in the forepart of the ship between decks, and virtually all were believed to have been killed by the explosion. No lifeboats were launched as the ship sank so quickly, and only two rafts managed to get away. Some witnesses said there were 200 personnel in the water at the time the ship sank. But as no distress signal was sent out, the survivors were left to struggle in the water, clutching for support on any debris and not even having time to don their life jackets. Many were injured with broken limbs and severe burns. When dawn came, not a ship could be seen. The sharks were all around, which had to be beaten off with pieces of timber. All that day, under the hot sun, the survivors struggled to stay alive. Captain Salt, the Torres Strait pilot, boosted their morale by assuring them they would soon be rescued, although he was in agony himself from the massive burns he had sustained. One nursing officer survived, Sister Ellen Savage, and it was her fortitude and example which in the end inspired the men to hang on until rescue came. She was a deeply religious woman and had grabbed her rosary beads as she raced semi-naked in her silk pyjamas from the cabin onto the deck, and was subsequently offered a pyjama coat for modesty by one of the sailors. When morale was low, she led the survivors in prayer and helped the second mate supervise the distribution of the small amount of food and water that they had. Whenever possible, she gave medical attention to the men, despite her own injuries of broken ribs, a fractured nose, perforated eardrums, and multiple bruising. All that day they drifted at sea, with only one plane being heard, and the ghastly realisation that they had not even been missed. The following day, the Saturday, 15th of May, again their spirits rose with the dawn, the hope that they might be rescued. They were eventually spotted by the USS Mugford, who signalled at 14:14 that they were picking up survivors from the Centaur. And this it was not searching for survivors, but just happened to be transiting from Brisbane across that area. And this was the first knowledge that the Centaur had been sunk. 6 hours later, 64 survivors were safely landed in Brisbane, 30 members of the ship's crew, one of 19 medical officers, one of 12 nursing officers, and 32 other ranks. The second 12th Field Ambulance was virtually wiped out, with only 15 survivors of 194 personnel. The ship's master, Captain Murray, was lost, as well as Matron Jewell, Chaplain Laverick, and the Red Cross representative, Mr. Darwin Clark. The survivors were hospitalised in Brisbane. The merchant seamen going to the Brisbane General Hospital, and the officers admitted to a local private hospital. The service personnel were admitted to the Green Slopes Repatriation Hospital, 24 being admitted with burns, and 10 other survivors being admitted to the medical ward. Amazingly, some were able to be discharged the following day due to only minor injuries. 2 days after the sinking, the Prime Minister Curtin stated, "The attack which took place a few miles off the Queensland coast bears all the marks of wantonness and deliberation. Not only will it stir our people into a more acute realisation of the type of enemy against whom we are fighting, but I am confident that this deed will shock the conscience of the whole civilised world and demonstrate to any who may have lingering doubts the unscrupulous and barbarous methods by which the Japanese conduct warfare." Shortly thereafter, Minister Beazley, who was the Minister for Supply and Shipping, announced the sinking at a meeting, not knowing the wife of one of the men lost was in the audience. On the day after the sinking, Tokyo Radio announced that the anti-Axis powers had attacked 40 Italian hospital ships, 8 of which had been sunk, but at no stage did Japan admit to sinking the Centaur. One of the survivors stated that the following night he had heard motors and saw the outline of what he thought was a submarine. Although this was under considerable consideration for quite some time, his sketches of the details of the submarine held in Navy archives in Canberra. Rumours spread far and wide that the ship was in fact carrying weapons, and even commandos, in contravention to the Hague Convention. Rupert Goodman, author of Hospital Ships, who has extensively researched the sinking of the Centaur, has a taped statement from one of the survivors in which he alleges that commandos carrying automatic weapons were embarked on the ship. In 1998, a Mr. John Clifton of Bathurst said that as a member of the 2nd 15th Australian Company, he had helped load ammunition onto the Centaur. He said the soldiers worked throughout the night loading the Centaur almost to the gunwales with cases of ammunition, rifles and machine guns. Another correspondent wrote in November 1990 to Rupert Goodman that 14 volunteers stayed with the Centaur for a special job, and 2 of these survived. Were these troops in fact commandos? Were they listed with the 2nd 12th Field Ambulance merely to meet the Hague Convention requirements? This aspect of the tragedy will never be resolved satisfactorily. The secret and confidential files of the commanding officer of the USS Mudford and the Naval Intelligence Staff Officer contain the name of one Colonel English, later amended to Lieutenant Colonel English, AMC, as one of the survivors plucked from the water. This name subsequently disappears from the list of survivors following their arrival and the interviews by Naval Intelligence. No such name appears on any official Army or Navy list of survivors, and none remember a doctor of that name among the staff on the board. Those in the water will remember only 2 people with medical knowledge, Lieutenant Colonel Altridge and Sister Savage. However, Lieutenant Colonel English has been named as the commander on board. During the war, there was a Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm English of the 2nd 4th Independent Commando Company, but there is no evidence linking this person with the Centaur. It would appear that perhaps the crew of USS Mudford may have confused Outridge with English, being unused to hearing strine, and the survivors, having been in the water for 36 hours, would not have been speaking clearly. Perhaps one of these days the question may be answered, but it's interesting that the pages from the regimental diary in the archive section of the War Memorial in Canberra have the pages missing from the period shortly before the ship sailed. Some secret files have been released, others are locked away until 100 years after the sinking. For many years it was believed that maybe Centaur had struck a mine. But in 1979, in the official Japanese history of submarine warfare, it was admitted that submarine I-177 fired the torpedo which sank the Centaur. No explanation has ever been given as to why it was sunk. It was a clear night, the Centaur was fully lit and clearly visible from a long distance. The commanding officer of I-177, Lieutenant Commander Nagagawa, who was still alive at the time, refused to make any comment on the matter. However, his record included firing on survivors from 5 British ships in the Indian Ocean, for which he was subsequently arrested, tried as a war criminal, and imprisoned for 6 years for his atrocities committed in the Indian Ocean. At no time was there any reference made to the Centaur. Despite a 3-year inquiry following the war by Supreme Command Allied powers, who undertook extensive investigations, were unable to come to any definite conclusion. On the 50th anniversary of the sinking of the Centaur, the survivors met at Point Danger at Coolangatta to dedicate a memorial to the sinking of the ship. In October 1990, in October 2019, she was declared a historic wreck. The wreck having been found in 2009 by David Mearns in some 2,000 metres of water, very close to the position where it was believed to have been sunk. There is a Centaur Park Memorial at Caloundra in Queensland, a Centaur Memorial Garden at the Repatriation Hospital here in Melbourne, and in May 1990 a Centaur Memorial window and roll of honour were dedicated at the Concord Repatriation General Hospital in Sydney in the presence of 5 of the survivors. But perhaps the greatest memorial of all was the £50,000 raised in 1948 as a Centaur Memorial Fund in memory of those nurses who went down with the ship. Remember, the Centaur had become a rallying cry for fundraising. What happened to the survivors? Lieutenant Colonel Edrill Eldridge did not return to the 2nd 12th Field Ambulance, and on his return to health, the Army gave him command of the 2nd 8th Field Ambulance. He went on to New Guinea, where he was mentioned in dispatches. At war's end, he set up private practice in Gympie, in Queensland, retaining his links with the Army through the reserve. Captain Jock Salt, the Torres Strait pilot, never went to sea again. He recovered from his burns after initially receiving treatment in Brisbane and was subsequently transferred for further treatment to a Sydney hospital. Second mate Rippon's only injury amounted to a large lump of clotted blood beneath one knee. He was released after a couple of weeks. He then took advantage of a week's survivor's leave in Melbourne, courtesy of the Blue Funnel Line, and afterwards, as the extra second mate on a Blue Funnel ship, he returned to England and resumed his seagoing career with subsequent promotion to captain, followed by many years in command. He retired from the Blue Funnel Line in 1974 at the age of 60 and retired to North Yorkshire. Chief Engineer Smith returned home to Cottesloe in Western Australia, retiring from the sea in 1967 and dying in 1987, aged 89 years. What of Sister Ellen Savage? She was awarded the George Medal for rendering conspicuous services whilst on the raft attending to wounds sustained by other survivors. Sister Savage is an example of high courage and fortitude to maintain morale of her companions during the ordeal. That was a quotation. After the war, she received the Florence Nightingale Scholarship at the Royal College of Nursing in London to study nursing administration. She later became matron of the Rankin Park Chest Hospital in Newcastle, where she remained until her retirement in 1967. She kept up her contacts with the Centaur survivors and retired Army Nursing Service members. Every year on the 14th of May, she attended a remembrance ceremony at Sydney Cenotaph. She never missed an Anzac Day reunion, and on Anzac Day 1985, she attended the usual hospital ship reunion lunch at Sydney Hospital. She made a speech, had a wonderful time renewing old acquaintances, and afterwards, whilst waiting for a taxi in the street, she collapsed and died, aged 72 years. Her portrait now hangs in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. During the war, 3,477 women served in the Australian Army Nursing Service, of whom 53 lost their lives to enemy action. 41 in Malaya, 1 on the Australian hospital ship Menunda during the bombing of Darwin, and 11 on the Centaur. The sinking of the Australian hospital ship Centaur was the single greatest tragedy to strike the Australian Army Medical Corps and the Australian Army Nursing Service during the Second World War. May they rest in peace. Thank you. To show that how they organised the accommodation on the ship. It must have been pretty cramped to have the crew as well as space for 200 patients on the ship. Yep. That just shows again how the ship was transformed from a cargo cattle carrying ship into a hospital ship. Lieutenant Colonel Manson is at the top there, Matron Sewell is at the middle, and Sister Savage is a photograph of her bottom taken before the event. That shows where the ship was travelling and where it was sunk and where the survivors were picked up 36 hours or so later. You can see how close it was to the Queensland coast. The previous one is the memorial at Caloundra, and the final photograph is Sister Savage when she was a patient in Greenslopes Hospital being interviewed. Thank you.
How many hospital ships we had in defence use during the Second World War? The loss of this one must have had a huge impact on our capacity to deal with the need to repatriate troops.
The registered hospital ships were Mananda. There were 5, including the Centaur, as I recall. I just can't give you their names off the top of my head. Orangi, I think, was one.
Yes, I think.
Centaur, Mananda.
Amongst hospital ships.
It was looked into in considerable depth because it was a significant excuse, if in fact, for the Japanese to sink it, if in fact it had been carrying weapons against the Hague Convention.
If they knew.
If they knew. Yeah.
Peter, in a time-honoured tradition of the Naval Historical Society, we try to encourage good health, which is in some ways, as you well know, profession, the result of good diet and healthy drinking. So, thank you very much.